Early in December 2021, Tailwind CSS released version 3.0 of its framework. The main changes in this version had been pioneered since version 2.1. Now, before we go over the specifics, let's take a look at how it works and what makes it a compelling option for component-based architectures. Tailwind CSS is known as a utility-first CSS framework. And one of the reasons behind it is that best practices don't actually work. So let me show you an example of why that's the case. My website, rabo.org, was built with Bootstrap and Eleventy. I'm going to scroll down to one of my pages, and then once I'm on this page, I'm going to right-click on this headline and select Inspect. On the left-hand side, you can see the HTML for this page. In the middle, you can see what we call the cascade, the C and CSS. Notice that in order to display this headline, the browser is gathering styles from different places. It's grabbing certain styles from a file called overrides.scss and some things from another style called reboot. If you scroll down, you can see that there is a third part called the user agent. Now, these are styles that the browsers create. And then some stuff is inherited from other places. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see the results of the cascade. So just to display this headline, the browser has to worry about the class that contains it, as well as the container for that, which is main content, and then also what's happening in these classes in the body section, as well as any browser defaults and any resets that Bootstrap is doing. Not only that, but even when doing a simple page like this, we end up writing styles that override what different things are already doing. As our CSS grows, those overrides get more and more complicated. So the utility-based approach lets you more explicitly define what you're doing and never worry about the styles affecting your current element. I know it sounds crazy, but it works really well. There's a few places where something like Bootstrap is superior. Tailwind CSS is just that, a CSS framework. Bootstrap, however, provides a lot more functionality. It has a rich set of components. So you have accordions, buttons, drop-downs, modals, pagination, all these things that are pre-built for you. That sort of thing is a lot more difficult to do in Tailwind because you have to specify styles for each one of those components. So in Tailwind, you end up with really scary styles for things like a button. Tailwind CSS is much better at working with component-based architectures like React, Vue, and Angular. It's really not that great if you want to use the same styles over and over in your HTML. But in a component-based architecture, every one of those elements is usually separated into an individual component. Now, it does provide this apply directive so that you can extract repeated utility patterns and create your own repeatable styles, but you have to do that manually. One huge advantage over Bootstrap is that Tailwind only ships the CSS that you need for your project. And most Tailwind projects will ship with less than 10 kilobytes of CSS to the client. Now, that does mean that you need to have a build process. So it's not as easy to work with as something like Bootstrap, where you just import a CSS style sheet into your project. Let's take a look at some of those new features. Now, they have a pretty cool video that explains a lot of the new features. First is the just-in-time engine. Now, this has actually been around since version 2.1. So let's dig into why that's such a powerful feature. Now, Tailwind CSS provides you clones of regular CSS classes. So for example, if we take a look at something like the display classes, it's just a series of shortcuts for the existing CSS classes. And you can see that for floats, it's just cloning the CSS classes as well. Now, it also has a lot of additional classes. So for example, if we look at colors, you'll notice that it has an extremely rich amount of colors. In older versions of Tailwind, to keep things small, it would only ship a certain number of the colors. Because it's shipping only what you need, they've turned on the ability to refer to any of the colors. Now, that's really important when you start using a lot of the interactivity features. So if you add, for example, a hover class to your background colors so that when you roll over it, you get a different color, you now have a main class plus a hover class for every one of the colors that the framework would ship with. That would originally make for a humongous CSS file, but with the just-in-time compiler, it's only going to ship what you're using. So where in older versions, certain parts of the framework were turned off, now everything is on and available to you. Jetty also gives you the option of creating your own custom classes. So here, for example, you can see how with brackets, we can create a size that doesn't exist. Or we can add a custom background color to an element. This is like using the style attribute, but you have the advantage of having access to all the modifiers that Tailwind comes with. There are some truly new features. So for example, you now have the ability to use colored box shadows. There are some different shadow sizes. So first you have to specify a shadow and then a size. In this case, we're using the large shadow. Then to specify the color of the drop shadow, you add the shadow prefix and then one of the colors with its strength like this. And then if you want to, you can optionally add a slash with an opacity setting. So by default, the shadows would have 100% opacity. Here we're specifying 50% opacity with a /50. There's also a number of new modifiers. One of them is the right to left and left to right modifier, which is something that Bootstrap added, but you have to add a separate style sheet for that. Again, because of the JIT compiler, this is much easier to do with something like Tailwind. You just specify the difference of what would happen in a left to right layout versus a right to left layout. There's also new portrait and landscape modifiers. You just specify what happens when a device sits in a specific mode. There's also a print modifier so that you can define what your styles look like when they're printed. One of the interesting things about Tailwind is that when CSS releases a new feature, it's pretty good about adding that feature as a shortcut. So they've added a few new ways to style your form elements. So now we have access to file input types with the file prefix. And also you have now the accent color. So you have a little bit more control over how different things look like checkboxes. And so you can see when you go, for example, to accent colors, that all this is doing is using one of the new CSS properties like accent color and providing a shortcut. In the same way, since CSS added some scroll margin classes, you now get this scroll snap API, which means that when you scroll right here, it'll try to snap to a certain point. We create a container class and then another class to define how this item is aligned to that container. Just like bell bottoms, multi-column layouts are back in CSS. So once again, Tailwind just provides you some shortcuts to that as well. The interesting thing is that you can use it with the modifiers to have these appear at certain widths using the Tailwind CSS grid. One of my favorite new additions to CSS is the new aspect ratio property. So of course you have access to that with Tailwind as well. So there's now an easy way to play with Tailwind CSS, and that's by using the play CDN. So what you do is you add a script tag. Notice that it's not a link tag. So this isn't linking to a CSS document. It's linking to a piece of JavaScript that is going to analyze your page and then serve you up a version of Tailwind CSS that works with whatever is on your page. Now this means that you should not use this for production because every time you load the page, it's going to have to do that calculation. They've even added their own playground at play.tailwindcss.com. You can replace all this text right here or play with the example. And it's fully configurable, so it's not actually using the CDN. So if you come over here, you can see that it has the prefixes. This is how you import the library in a normal build process. And it even has access to the config file. Over here, you can change the layout, and you can also turn on dark mode. And this is sort of a mobile size option so that you can play around with the mobile size here. If you want to share your changes with somebody, let's change the color of this text right here. Then you can click this share button and it's going to create a link right here that you can share with somebody else.